Driver's license and proof of status, please.
I'm Dr. Maya Winters, a trauma surgeon. I'm on my way to a critical patient. Please call my hospital.
License isn't enough. Step out of the vehicle for secondary inspection.
You can verify me in 30 seconds. My patient is bleeding out.
What happens when the very systems designed to maintain order end up costing an innocent person their life? Have you ever been judged instantly before you even had the chance to speak a single word? Today, we are diving into a profoundly tragic and staggering legal case that ultimately cost the federal government nearly $9 million. But far more devastating than the financial payout is the human cost. It cost a father of three his life. This is a story about the fatal collision of bureaucratic protocol, unspoken bias, and a ticking clock that could not be stopped. As we walk through these events, ask yourself, at what point does following procedure become a dangerous evasion of common sense? If you believe that a highly trained medical professional's life-saving credentials should never be cast aside because of a hasty misjudgment, let me know your thoughts in the comments as we unfold this incredibly tense narrative. The desert sun was just beginning to breach the horizon, painting the Arizona sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. Dr. Maya Winters was navigating her sedan down the eastbound lanes of the interstate. She was running on absolute fumes. For the past 16 hours, she had been standing under the blinding surgical lights of the trauma bay, piecing broken lives back together. She was still wearing her blue hospital scrubs, faintly speckled with the physical evidence of the night's grueling labor. All she wanted was the quiet sanctuary of her home and a few hours of uninterrupted sleep. Then the Bluetooth system in her car chimed. It was the surgical director at her hospital. His voice was entirely stripped of its usual calm demeanor. There had been a massive multi-vehicle collision on the highway. The emergency room was being flooded with critical trauma victims, and they needed their absolute best trauma surgeon back in the bay immediately. Without a second thought, the exhaustion vanished from Maya's body, replaced by a surge of pure adrenaline. She whipped the vehicle around at the next median, engaged her hazard lights, and pushed the accelerator down. She was racing against the most unforgiving opponent in medicine: time. She had absolutely no idea that she was driving directly into an administrative bottleneck that would become the center of a monumental civil rights lawsuit. A few miles down the road, the traffic abruptly thickened, eventually grinding to a complete halt. Ahead, a gauntlet of orange cones and flashing law enforcement vehicles choked the three-lane highway down to just one. It was a routine federal inspection checkpoint. As Maya inched forward, she observed the process. There was a chaotic rhythm to it. Some vehicles were waved through with barely a glance, while others were aggressively directed to the shoulder for intense scrutiny. To an observer, the pattern of who was scrutinized and who was dismissed seemed entirely arbitrary, driven by silent, rapid-fire assumptions rather than objective criteria. When Maya finally reached the front, an agent stepped up to her window. The beam of a heavy tactical flashlight pierced the dawn light sweeping across the interior of her car. The agent's voice was flat and highly practiced, requesting her driver's license and documentation of legal residency. Maya's heart was hammering against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady and professional. She explained immediately that she was a trauma surgeon at the local memorial hospital, currently en route to a catastrophic medical emergency where a patient was actively bleeding out. She handed over her state-issued driver's license, which clearly displayed her local address and a pristine record. The agent barely glanced at the plastic card. Her expression remained entirely impassive, rooted in a visual misjudgment she had already made the moment Maya pulled up. The agent stated that a driver's license was insufficient for their specific inspection purposes and demanded further documentation, such as a passport or a birth certificate. Panic began to strictly weave itself into Maya's frustration. She tried to reason, explaining that nobody carries their birth certificate to a grueling night shift at the hospital. She was born in the Midwest. She had spent over a decade practicing medicine in this very state. She gestured to her scrubs, offering to present her official hospital identification badge. which contained the direct phone number of the surgical director who was waiting for her. She pleaded with the agent to simply make a 30-second phone call to verify her identity and the life or death nature of her journey. Instead of listening, the situation escalated. Another agent approached the passenger side of her vehicle, his posture rigid, his hand resting instinctively near his duty belt. In the hyper-vigilant world of law enforcement, Maya's desperate urgency was being instantly mistranslated as defiance. The first agent commanded her to pull over to the secondary inspection area, framing her entirely reasonable plea to call the hospital as a failure to comply with a lawful order. Every single surgeon knows that the human body has a point of no return. Maya glanced at the clock on her dashboard. The minutes were slipping away like sand. If she fought them, she risked physical altercation and arrest. If she complied, she knew with sickening certainty that her patient's chances of survival were plummeting with every passing second. Moving deliberately to avoid startling the tense agents, she retrieved her hospital badge. It clearly listed her name, her prestigious medical credentials, and her role as a senior trauma specialist. She held it out, practically begging them to look at the facts instead of their assumptions. The agent took the badge, looked at it, and reiterated that it was not an acceptable form of federal status verification. They explicitly refused to call the hospital. They demanded she turn off the engine and step out of the vehicle. She was being officially detained for further investigation. As Maya stood on the dusty shoulder of the interstate, the cool morning air biting at her blood-stained scrubs, a profound sense of helplessness washed over her. She loudly and clearly stated her full name, her birthplace, her citizenship status, and the grave medical consequences of this delay, hoping the body cameras were capturing every single word. She was escorted to the holding compartment of a government SUV. Her cell phone vibrated violently in her pocket. She knew it was the operating room. She was strictly forbidden from answering it. Miles away, beneath the blinding lights of the surgical suite, a nightmare was unfolding. The patient was a 34-year-old father named Marcus. Just an hour earlier, he had kissed his wife goodbye and headed off to his shift, driving a commercial truck. Now he was lying on an operating table with a devastating internal injury. His blood pressure was crashing rapidly. The surgical director, a highly skilled and respected cardiovascular surgeon, was staring at the monitors in quiet horror. He had called Maya's phone repeatedly, receiving nothing but voicemail. He knew that the specific type of traumatic internal injury Marcus had suffered required the highly specialized rapid-fire techniques of a seasoned trauma surgeon. It wasn't his exact specialty, but there was absolutely no one else. The clock had run out. Making a decision that would haunt him forever, the director called for the scalpel. He had to attempt the repair himself. For agonizing hours, the director fought desperately. He executed every procedure perfectly by the textbook. But textbooks don't bleed, and they don't capture the chaotic, unforgiving nature of a shattered liver. Despite every ounce of effort, every unit of transfused blood, and every desperate maneuver, the damage was simply too catastrophic. Mid-morning, the piercing, continuous tone of the heart monitor signaled the end. Marcus was gone. At that exact moment, in a sterile holding cell miles down the highway, Maya was finally being processed. She had been fingerprinted. She had been photographed. She had been treated entirely based on an unfounded visual bias, stripped of her professional dignity and her fundamental right to simply exist unbothered in her own community. It wasn't until over 2 hours after her initial stop that a supervising agent finally picked up a phone and dialed the number on her hospital badge. When the cardiovascular surgeon answered, his hands were still trembling from the loss of his patient. He confirmed Maya's identity, her critical role, and the extreme emergency she had been desperately trying to reach. The heavy, suffocating silence that fell over the holding facility as the supervising agent realized the catastrophic magnitude of their misjudgment was palpable. Maya was released immediately. There was no formal apology. There was no acknowledgement of the profound tragedy their delay had just caused. She was simply handed back her belongings and told she was free to leave. She ran to her vehicle, her hands shaking violently as she keyed the ignition. She immediately dialed the hospital director. When he answered, she rapidly explained the detention, the checkpoint, the complete refusal of the agents to verify her story. She told him she was finally on her way, pushing the engine to its limits. The director's voice cracked, sounding older and more tired than she had ever heard him. He told her to stop driving. He told her she didn't need to rush anymore. The silence that followed was the heaviest thing Maya had ever experienced. In that devastating pause, she knew. She pulled the car over to the side of the road, gripped the steering wheel, and broke down. Surgeons lose patience. It is the agonizing reality of the profession. But to lose a patient not to the limits of modern medicine, but to the stubborn, rigid enforcement of an unfounded assumption, that was an entirely different kind of grief. Later that day, Marcus's wife, Maria, received the kind of news that fundamentally breaks a person's universe into a before and an after. The hospital director was painfully honest with her. He explained the severity of the injuries, but he also had to answer the excruciating question of why the trauma specialist wasn't in the room. He told her about the missed calls, the absence, and his own desperate attempt to fill a role he wasn't uniquely trained for. When the full truth emerged, when the timeline of the checkpoint detention aligned perfectly with the timeline of Marcus's fading vital signs, the grief immediately metamorphosed into righteous, burning anger. Maya retained a powerhouse civil rights attorney who instantly recognized the explosive nature of the situation. This wasn't merely a minor inconvenience or a simple bureaucratic oversight. This was a textbook deprivation of civil rights under the color of law, culminating in a wrongful death. The lawsuit that followed was a seismic event. The plaintiffs named the federal government, the specific agents involved, and their direct supervisor. They alleged unlawful detention, severe violations of the Fourth Amendment regarding unreasonable search and seizure, and a devastating reliance on implicit bias that completely abandoned the legal standard of reasonable suspicion. The trial was an emotional battleground that stretched for weeks. The most damning witness wasn't a person at all. It was the unblinking eye of the agent's own body cameras. The jury watched in absolute silence as the footage played. They saw a brilliant surgeon, clearly identifying herself, calmly explaining the life or death stakes, presenting valid identification, and literally begging the agents to make a simple, verifying phone call. They saw law enforcement officers stare blankly past the facts, their decision-making clouded by an instant, erroneous judgment based purely on appearances. Medical experts took the stand and delivered the fatal mathematical blow. With Maya's specialized trauma expertise, Marcus's chances of surviving that specific injury hovered around 80%. Without her relying on a surgeon outside his primary specialty, those odds plummeted to 30%. The delay at the checkpoint wasn't just an inconvenience. It was the direct, undeniable catalyst for a preventable death. When Maya took the stand, the courtroom was entirely captivated. She described the profound humiliation of standing on the asphalt, her scrubs stained with the blood of previous patients, trying to convince agents of her own government that she belonged there. She spoke about the oath she took to save lives and how a completely arbitrary system of visual judgment had forced her to break that oath. The defense attempted to hide behind the shield of standard operating procedure. They argued that the agents were simply executing their duties, conducting a lawful investigatory stop, and following the rigid protocols of border and immigration enforcement. But Maya's attorney systematically dismantled that defense during cross-examination. He cornered the lead agent with a devastating line of questioning. He forced the agent to admit that Maya had clearly stated her profession, clearly articulated the emergency, and clearly offered a swift method of verification. Did her valid hospital identification, combined with her medical scrubs and explicit explanation, Not create even a shadow of a doubt regarding your initial assumption, the attorney asked, his voice echoing in the quiet room. The agent could only fall back on the repetition of procedure, admitting that making a 30-second phone call was not explicitly written in their handbook for that specific step of the detention. The attorney expertly highlighted the core legal failure. An investigatory stop must be supported by particularized objective facts. The agents had ignored all the objective facts presented to them, choosing instead to rely on an entirely subjective, biased assumption. The jury didn't need long to see the glaring truth. They returned a staggering verdict, finding the defendants liable across the board. The damages awarded were astronomical, totaling nearly $9 million, split between compensatory damages for the family's unimaginable loss and punitive damages meant to send a blindingly clear message to the bureaucratic systems at large. In the aftermath, the specific agents were quietly reassigned to administrative roles far away from public interaction. The checkpoint itself was eventually shut down, not because the agency admitted to a systemic constitutional failure, but because the public relations nightmare became simply too toxic to sustain. The official statements released were masterclasses in bureaucratic evasion, citing routine updates to training rather than acknowledging the profound human tragedy that necessitated them. Maya took a massive portion of her settlement and established a medical scholarship in Marcus's name, specifically designed to support brilliant young minds from underrepresented backgrounds entering the medical field. She continues to save lives in the trauma bay, but she also spends her time fiercely advocating for legal literacy among medical professionals, ensuring they know exactly how to assert their rights when authority oversteps its bounds. Maria channeled her devastating grief into a powerful force for change, becoming a relentless advocate for systemic reform, testifying in front of congressional committees about the lethal consequences of institutional bias. This case is now required reading in both medical and legal academies. For doctors, it is a chilling reminder that their dedication can be entirely neutralized by a broken system. For law students, it is the ultimate case study on the limits of authority and the catastrophic danger of allowing implicit bias to masquerade as reasonable suspicion. Marcus never knew why the trauma specialist didn't burst through those doors. He only knew in his final fading moments that the help he desperately needed simply never arrived. And that is the true insidious cost of letting assumptions override common sense. It doesn't just strip individuals of their dignity, it actively steals the future from families who never see it coming. What are your thoughts on this incredible case? How should emergency situations be handled when they clash with rigid law enforcement protocols? Drop your opinions in the comments below. Hit that like button if you found this deep dive insightful, and make sure to subscribe for more gripping stories where the law, morality, and human lives intersect.